anyway, Kant was a very good entertainer, actually. He gave good parties. Anyway, but enough of that. But these pragmatists are definitely neo-Humeans. And the pragmatists, yeah, they talk, John Dewey writes a lot about the body, especially in his philosophy of education. John Dewey is mostly known, and he's the leading, right? If we're to rank him, he's number one. In terms of influence on our culture and prodigiousness of philosophical production and just esteem in the community of philosophers, John Dewey is by far the most well-known and most famous. That's partly just because he lived so long. You know, poor William James had a bad heart. All the male Jameses had bad hearts. They all died fairly young in their 60s of a heart attack. And John Dewey was and he lived all the way up into his 90s, and he was writing all the way. You know, he's active the whole time. So he just wrote a lot. But John Dewey is most known for his work in philosophy of education. And he's really big on getting kids into their bodies, you know, and teaching them. He thinks the early stages of childhood education should be all about embodiment. Anyway, so this is the pragmatist metaphysic, right? This is the pragmatist answer to what James calls a metaphysical question. Good, bad, value, and obligation have no absolute natures or meanings independent of personal support. This we could call William James's axiology, in a sense, right? But what does it include? We're not sure, because of my questions about whether or not we can include species or ecosystems. We probably can certainly include all living beings, right? Certainly sentient beings, as making moral claims, right? But our question for today, can we think of an ecological whole as making a moral claim? Can we think of a species as making a moral claim? Because if we cannot think of a species or an ecological whole as making moral claims, then there is no coextensive moral obligation to cover them, right? I mean, there can't be, right? There can be no moral obligation without a moral claim, right? And if an ecological whole is not making any moral claims, if a species is not making any moral claims, we're kind of, out to lunch. So let's see. Let's think about that. All right? Can a pragmatist plausibly assert that an ecological whole or a species viewed over a very long course of geological and evolutionary time can we think of a species or an ecological whole as making moral claims upon us, which would call out moral obligations, right? The best course, okay, so anyway, these are our normative. I don't know why I maybe should have, this is obviously all review. Oh, okay, well, let's go over it. Egoism, very simply, the best course of action, the egoist will say, right? These are their answers to the normative question, right? The normative question is, what is the proper measurement? Not what has status, right? We have to figure out what has status. But then on top of that, that's the axiological question, right? But then on top of that, we have to ask, well, how do we go around measuring moral value once we've identified what entities have it, okay? And the egocentrist, of course, is going to be just thrown right back on. I'm going to do whatever makes me feel good, right? Whatever satisfies my felt preferences is, or perhaps my deeper preferences is the right thing to do. I say it's not really normative theory, but it probably is. Anyway, utilitarianism, we've been over that. The best course of action is the one which satisfies the felt preferences of the greatest number of individuals. All right, traditionally only human individuals, of course, are included in the utilitarian calculations. Conservationism can be thought of as rural utilitarianism applied to natural resource policy. Natural resources should be managed so as to produce the greatest good. All right, again, the land management tradition of conservationism is strictly anthropocentric and individualistic. Then we get into the neo-Humeans, and that's their philosophical lineage, right? Hume, Smith, Darwin, and Leopold, and Collicutt, if Collicutt's right about all that. Also includes pragmatist thinkers such as William James and John Dewey, and their philosophical descendants like Anthony Weston and Brian Norton. And for them, the best course of action is the one which is consistent with preserving the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. Remember, these guys are all holists in some sense, and they all believe, going back to David Hume and Adam Smith, they all accept that there are values expressed in communities, in whole systems, not just in individuals. All right. So for the neo-Humean ecocentrists, natural resources, land, air, water, wildlife should be managed for the greatest good of the biotic community. Preservationism is implicitly holistic and may be either anthropocentric or non-anthropocentric. All right, and of course they have these big questions though that we've been trying trying to answer ourselves. How should community be defined? What is the greatest good of the community? How should we define integrity, stability, and beauty? All right, and there's our very severe-looking taskmaster. But, all right, so this is, again, some more review. For environmental pragmatists, they're giving us a unique, maybe uniquely American perspective on epistemology and ethics. True, right? True is the subject of epistemology. You take a class in epistemology, your whole project is to try to explain what a truth claim is and how you identify a truth claim, right? For environmental pragmatists, true and good natural resource policy can only be determined with reference to living, sentient beings who are actively trying to live flourishing lives in harmony with their communities. Truth in natural resource management is that set of assertions about human use of natural resources which is most likely to prevail in the long run. Right? Remember, this is from Norton, given certain social and ecological conditions. But I think all the environmental pragmatists are going to accept this. The truth in any particular situation is that which is sustainable in light of all other known truths which are relevant to that situation. The good, meanwhile, in natural resource management is that set of assertions about natural resource values which is most compatible with respect for all the other sorts of values that are interwoven with natural resource values. A good policy regarding some given set of natural resources is one which is consistent with sustaining as many as possible of the other values known to be associated with that set of natural resources. Environmental pragmatism tries to determine not which resource management principles are true in some abstract sense, right? Because there is no such sense for the pragmatist, but which are adequate to uphold certain shared intuitions about what is needed to live a good human life. All right, I know that's a lot, but so let's go back though to William James's famous essay, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life. It's remarkably, it's just refreshing, and when you read it, you almost think, wow, this is so simple. You know, why did I get all confused about moral philosophy? And why did I think it was so hard? But from a pragmatist point of view, the only answer, the only objectively truthful answer to the question of what are our obligations, we are obligated to see to it, to live our lives in such a way that as many moral claims as possible can be met. Okay? And it's really just kind of quantitative whenever there's a moral claim. Now, obviously, some moral claims are totally inconsistent with the moral claims of hundreds or thousands of other beings, right? So those moral claims need to be sliced out by a pragmatist moral philosophy, right? A pragmatist environmental ethic is going to say, okay, well, there's a parasite organism, right? It's making a moral claim. The ticks that are wiping out, that are really, really, really stressing out the moose on Isle Royal, right? They're making moral claims. It's all related to anthropogenic climate destabilization. But the ticks, the moose populations are plummeting, as almost every other species population is plummeting, but the moose, especially in their the southern end of their range, which is, you know, around the Great Lakes. That's, you know, they get into Maine, they get a little bit into Vermont and New Hampshire, but they don't go very much south of there, you know, and they don't go very much south of, you know, the upper peninsula in Michigan and northern Minnesota. And anyway, and in the southern ranges of their habitat, they're dying off because the ticks, I mean, literally thousands and thousands and thousands, just disgusting is what the biologists who are out there working in the field observing, it's what they're reporting, that when they find a moose carcass or when they find a really sick moose, that moose is just literally covered head to tail with thousands and thousands of ticks, and they're all sucking the blood out, and they spread diseases too, from what I understand, and they just weaken the moose to the point where they can't eat anymore and they die. So anyway, but those ticks are making a moral claim, right? They're saying, we want to live, we want to live. We've evolved for millions of years to where we are now, and we want to live, and we want to spread our numbers, right? We want to multiply. So, so an environmental ethicist has to consider that, right? At least consider it, right? Invite it to disclose, invite the tick to disclose its moral status, right? And on the face of it, it has to have some moral status. That's what Birch would say, right? Yeah, on the face of it, there's something there, like everything, right? If we invite it to, we can see it's doing something, right? But above all, it's wanting to live. It's defending its kind. It's defending its life, right? And yet, its defense of its life is completely fundamentally inconsistent with the defense of the lives of the moose, right? And the defense of the lives of all the other animals that depend on the moose, right? So, slice that out, right? We can say we do not have, in fact, we have a moral obligation to suppress the population of ticks. Right? We have a moral obligation to suppress and destroy disease organisms and parasites if it's within our power to do so. Right? Not inconsistent. Our ordinary, let's see. All right, so anyway, I already went over this one. All right. So now we're going to get into Thomas Birch's essay a little bit. Thomas Birch notes that a deontic experience is an experience of that which one must do. Birch argues that however rigorously and comprehensively we define the moral status of more than human entities, our emergent experience of that which we must do, emergent especially in light of what we know, right, about ecology and biology, our emergent experience of that which we must do will always exceed our definition of the moral status, of however we define it, right? The autopoietic features, right? Self-creating, self-organizing, storied achievement, flourishing, abounding all over the place, just infinite stories. We're this amazing species that's evolved and adapted over millions of years, right? Okay, but now all of a sudden along we come to the rocks in the fumaroles at the edge of Lake Superior, or we come to some other thing that doesn't have storied achievement, and yet, so that's an example, right? So our deontic experience, that which our emergent experience of that which we must do will always exceed our definition of moral status, okay? Where X equals that which has moral status, further investigation and openness, right? Inviting things to disclose their moral status inevitably discloses that we have obligations to more than X, okay? Where X is that which has moral status, further investigation inevitably discloses that we have obligations to more than X. New obligations emerge from the simple act of paying attention, right? Attentiveness is the first moral act, right? But notice that when we're talking about a non-human, any entity, I was going to say, obviously even more so with a human, respect is a prerequisite, and respect is folded into the very act of paying attention, of giving it real attention. In order to give attention to the chimpanzee, you have to respect the chimpanzee. You can't just say, it's just just another, animal, machine, whatever, is just working on instincts. No, you have to respect, you have to pay attention. When you want to learn about dogs, you typically have to study animals in the wild, right? Because that's the only place you can actually respect them. You're not respecting them if you're studying them in a zoo. As far as I can tell, you're respecting some parts about them if you're sincerely trying to keep their species alive by, some captive breeding program or something like that. And that's okay. It's painful to think about, but really, this guy named Jim Nolman Jim Nolman, Dolphin Dream Time, I think is the name of his book. Actually, I was brought to that book by Anthony Weston. He writes about it in one of his essays. But this guy, Jim Nolman, goes out to where the dolphins are in Florida and other places around the world and plays music. He's got a guitar, an amplifier, I don't know what else, but he's got speakers on his boat, right, underwater speakers. And then he's got microphones too, right? And so he'll jam with the dolphins and they'll totally get into it. And they're clearly responding to what he's doing with his guitar and his voice or whatever instruments he has on the boat. Anyway, but Nolman, also writes about the importance of approaching animals in the wild, because that's really the only way you can respect them, right? You're not respecting them if they're not in the wild. Anyway, so trying to, if we're serious about learning to communicate with dolphins, we have to go to them, right? We can't expect them to just be subjects of our study in a laboratory somewhere. Human sense and reason. All right, now I would identify three major innovations in moral philosophy that all came about in the second half of the 19th century. And those new schools of moral philosophy, go by the names of pragmatism, phenomenology, and feminism. Feminism, comes from all over the place, but it really starts to get big and influential in the late 19th century, and then phenomenology comes out of the work of some German philosophers, as a lot of this stuff does. Phenomenology is Edmund Husserl working in the... Edmund Husserl, I think, is exactly his dates. He was born the same year as John Dewey. John Dewey was born in 1859. And that reminds me, I said that The Origin of Species was published in 1847. Whenever I make a factual mistake like that, and then it haunts me, and I go back and try, anyway, 1859, and coincidentally, that was the same year, publication of Origin of the Species, that John Dewey was born, who's the leading pragmatist, and then also the same year that Edmund Husserl in Germany was born, who's a leading phenomenologist, whose philosophical descendants include all the existentialists and the great phenomenologists in France and Germany in the 20th century. They all go back to Edmund Husserl. Anyway, but these different schools, they're not just schools of moral philosophy, they're schools of philosophy, right? They make contributions to epistemology, to metaphysics, to ethics, moral philosophy, the whole gamut. But all of these schools of thought emerged around the same time in the second half of the 20th century, and they all share the view that human sense and reason are capable and do understand, capable of understanding and do all the time understand interrelationships among events and beings, as well as the events and the beings themselves. Some of our interrelationships with more than human entities, for example with ecological wholes, have moral dimensions insofar as what we do to them affects their interests, our interests, or the interests of the various other, the moral claims, right? Having an interest means making a moral claim of other species and individual lives that depend on them. All right? So because we can understand, we're not just restricted to understanding discrete beings, discrete events. We're also obviously capable of understanding all these interrelationships among them too. And those are truths also. Right? The interrelationships are truths also which support moral claim, which support moral obligations. All right? So remember William James's account of the meaning of making a moral claim. According to James, moral claims can only be made by beings with interests, beings who care about what happens to them. A moral claim can exist only where there is a being with interests, a being who must obtain a certain result, right? Nourishment, hydration, warmth, shelter, long-term survival, right? Beings have to obtain these results. Otherwise, wherever there's an interest, there is a moral claim, and wherever there's a moral claim, there's the possibility of a moral obligation, if you care about, if you're a being that cares about that moral claim. Deontic experience. In a morally optimal universe, every being's interests and corresponding moral claims would be met with no struggle at all, right? And that's what William James says, and he seems to be right about that, right? If things were optimal in our universe, but sadly enough, they're not, right? We have tragic circumstances in the universe. That's just how it got set up, We kind of wish it was set up differently, right? And we didn't have to struggle, but sorry, the struggle goes along with this universe that we have, all right? So we cannot live in such a universe. There is a moral struggle because some beings' interests conflict with other beings' interests, right? Well, duh. It seems so obvious. It's not worth mentioning. In any given resource management situation, not all moral claims can be met. The morally best resource management decision is the one that satisfies as many moral claims as possible. The claims of parasites and disease organisms, for example, must be left unsatisfied and outright rejected because they are not compatible with the vital interests and the corresponding very strong, right? If you have a vital interest, that means you have a very strong moral claim of the beings that they infect. Does a species, okay, now these are the questions, and we'll stop and take our break when we're done with these questions, all right? These are the questions I'm inviting all of us to think about today, and as we move forward. Does a species make moral claims? Does a species have vital interests? Does a biotic community make moral claims? Does a biotic community have vital interests? Does an ecosystem make moral claims? So 4 different things, right? Species, biotic communities, ecosystems, and then Earth. Does Earth make moral claims? Does Earth have vital interests? Does a species strive to keep itself in being? Well, we've already kind of waited. If that's what it means to make moral claims or to have vital interests, it's an odd way of thinking, isn't it? Odd way of putting it. A species strive? What would that mean? Rolston, of course, says yes to all this, right? Rolston, he's nailed it, right? With his very sophisticated knowledge of evolutionary history. He says, yes, every species strives to keep itself in being. Does a biotic community strive? Yeah, Rolston says yes to that too, right? But what is this business of striving? How can a species strive? It's crazy, isn't it? How can ecosystems strive? How can Earth strive? What's the striving? Who's the thing that's striving? Anyway, maybe we need to stop thinking this way, though. And maybe the pragmatists leave room for us, to reconsider experience as including the long-term experience of a species over the course of its evolutionary history, right? And then there is an experiencing entity there, right, making moral claims. If the answers to the 4 preceding questions are yes, then perhaps it makes sense to speak of species, biotic communities, ecosystems, and Earth as making moral claims. If the answers to the 4 preceding questions are yes, in other words, then perhaps the needs of ecological wholes should somehow be factored into the moral calculations of resource managers. Okay, and I know, I hope this is all flowing along. I believe I'm explaining it fairly well. I realize it's difficult, though. So anyway, let's take a break and just come back at 5 minutes after 1, and we'll continue. And we'll get into Weston a little bit. All right? Oh, and by the way, I have extra copies. Who wants a copy of? I only printed out 9 because the philosophy department, their budget is so low that they start giving us the 3rd degree to print out. So I was very reluctant. I printed out 10 copies. Anyway, and I could print out more though. Okay, so I have 2 more here. Who else needs one? Anybody? Not able. I realized people had trouble accessing, downloading, and printing out. So you all get an extension if you want it. All right, till Tuesday on the Thomas Birch. I have 1 more, and I can print out more. Anybody want to take my last Thomas Birch copy? Because it was hard. Some of you did succeed, though, in printing it out, right?
Yeah. It was weird. Like, the link itself didn't connect to the...
To the article, it connected to a database that you had to...
Yeah, so you
I
had
tried to
to
mess around. Yeah, because I tried emailing you, and eventually I found it, and so it worked out. But
yeah, it's kind of aggravating, isn't it? When I copy and paste a link from my desktop in my office, it just opens right up for me. But I think that's because I'm already logged into
that's what I figured. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I opened in the library, it did open. When I went home and opened, it did not.
Okay, well there you go. Yeah, so the key was to open it in the library, and then you have to pay to print it out in the library, right? Anyway. simple things. It seems to be what Thomas Birch is saying, that everything. He seems to blur the question too. It's not just that we are obligated to give everything due consideration, due respect and attentiveness. Okay? That's one type of claim, right? Another type of claim would be that everything has moral status, and that's why we're obligated to. But I think Birch is saying that we have duties to everything until proven otherwise. For example, but the question of whether or not an entity can be reasonably identified as striving to keep itself in being, right? This question is not dispositive. It's not, it's not, if once we do answer that question, remember, we still don't know. We might still have obligations to something, even though we've concluded that it's not actually striving to keep itself in being. Those things way at the margin, like a virus, I guess more recently, geneticists and whatnot, determined that viruses are alive. But for a long time, they were not identified as living things. What were they? I don't know. But what's another good example? Crystal formations. The stalactites and the stalagmites in the cave, and all the little gems, that crystallize themselves in the earth, and they seem to grow, and the crystals, what do? They duplicate themselves? Crystals grow, right? So, is there some striving to keep itself in being? I don't know. Rolston would say no, right? And Rolston, of course, for Rolston, the answer to this question means everything, right? But for our new friend, Uncle Thomas Birch, he says no. That's not the ultimate question. That's not the most important question at all. Because once we've answered that question, we still have not answered the question, do we owe anything to this being? Okay? Yeah, sure, it may or may not be striving to keep it. There's still another question we have to ask. And he says that the best course of action is to remain open as long as possible to the notion that an entity does have moral status. So I guess maybe this is a bit of an abrupt shift. Yes, go ahead.
So I've got this thing I can't quite shake. Everything has moral status. Everything deserves to be considered innately before.
Yes, at least in this raw sense of consider.
So it seemed that he almost suggested even an academic paper needs to also be considered. And so do I need to consider him asking me to consider something? Well,
in what sense? Your paper, the physical paper itself,
the physical article
morally
that you wrote, the words on the page, that needs to be considered. Does that have moral status? Does his paper itself have moral status? And is he not creating some sort of circular argument there if I have to consider him considering? Does that make sense at all?
He's just making a claim about lived experience, I think.
Okay.
He's making a claim about practical lived experience, and there's no getting around he's just saying there's no getting around the physical, practical need of checking first, paying close attention before we just discard an entity into the scrap heap of a sacrifice zone, right? Let's slow down a little bit. And maybe those rocks are important because they're doing something. Let's slow down. Let's invite those rocks to disclose their moral status to us. And they might not have any, but then they have moral status insofar as we see them in their interrelationship with everything else.
So he wouldn't be saying that an argument within itself has moral status?
No. An argument is going to earn its validity through the system of peer review by people reading it and then responding to it, and it develops a life of its own and makes its own contribution to the emerging understanding of moral philosophy or of natural resource values, etc., right? But non-moral truth accrues through this same process that moral truth accrues, right? I mean, there's an ongoing trial and error process, right? There's an ongoing, we put on certain truths like clothing, right? And then we find the weather changes, and then we need other truths, right? The circumstances are different. That's the pragmatist understanding, that our truth claims are not some kind of Kantian abstract order. We're not mapping.
It's not like an absolute right clothing to wear for all.
Exactly, no, yeah. All right, so let's go back, and this is review 2. Norton, obviously these pragmatists are not conservationists, okay? So we need to make sure we understand why that is. Environmental pragmatism is not anything like conservationism. Okay, well, I shouldn't say that. The pragmatists flirt with the utilitarians. William James dedicated his book, the only book, I think, with the title Pragmatism, that any of those guys wrote. He wrote it soon enough that nobody, could steal his title. Anyway, but he dedicates that book, Pragmatism, he dedicates it to who? John Stuart Mill. The pragmatists and William James had great admiration for the work of John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians. I started to say, but there are significant differences, okay, between an environmental pragmatist understanding of right